What if I told you that the same people that are controlling your money are pulling the strings behind the scenes, pushing us closer to World War III? I know, it sounds crazy, right? But what if it's part of a sinister plan? A plan to profit from chaos and to trap us in economic slavery and to force an entirely new financial system upon us that controls how we spend every dollar we earn. In this video, we are going to dive deep into the Federal Reserve's power plays, the hidden agenda behind their actions, and why this will impact every single one of us, regardless where you live around the world. So stick around until the very end, because the truth will shock you. And this is something that you need to know before it is too late. So before we dive in, do me one quick favor. If you enjoy watching videos like this one, then make sure to smash the like button. And if you haven't done so yet, also make sure to subscribe to my channel, because I'm going to be posting regular videos just like this one, where I break down complex topics in the world of money, finance, and investing. So without any further ado, let's get started. So the evil plan of the Federal Reserve to start World War III. So this whole story starts in the early 1900s, in the Panic of 1907. So what happened during that period? Well, in the US, at that point in time, there were many different banks around the nation. Also, all of those banks were issuing their own paper currencies, and you could use those paper currencies to redeem, let's say, gold. However, with the deposits of the depositors, the banks were actually taking excessive risks. And to the point where one major bank, almost collapsed. And actually it did collapse, causing a major panic and a major bank run on other banks as well. We call this the Panic of 1907. So the Panic of 1907 was a financial crisis where major banks and businesses in the US nearly collapsed due to risky investments and a lack of regulation. People panicked and rushed to withdraw all their money from banks, causing many banks to fail. So yeah, uncertainty, chaos, bank failures, not a great time. So here you see some black and white pictures. People protested. Everyone was fearful. They didn't know what to expect and whether their whole livelihoods were basically getting destroyed, or everything that they built up, that they were going to lose it. So yeah, very tough times. Fortunately, there was a savior, a hero called J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, which was a very wealthy banker. He amassed his fortune by being a financier, but also by consolidating many different industries, including, for example, the railroad sector in the US. So JP Morgan had to step in with his own money to stop the crisis. Basically, he said, calm down, guys, we got this. I will make sure to back these banks so that you can all get your deposits, or all can sleep tonight with peace of mind, knowing that your deposits are secured. However, later, JP Morgan used this influence to create the Federal Reserve in 1913 to prevent further future financial disasters. So here you see a picture of JP Morgan, one of the great tycoons in history, had a massive impact on political level, the whole financial system. In the end, he became much more than a banker. He was seen more as like a power broker. So let's talk about the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. So this was the act that created the Federal Reserve. So the 1913 Federal Reserve Act is the legislation that created the Federal Reserve System in the US. The law was passed after years of economic turmoil in the country. That's what we just discussed. So the Panic of 1907, which was basically a longer period, but the peak was in 1907. And Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act to establish economic stability in the US by introducing a central bank to oversee monetary policy. So the big issue that we had prior to this was that there were many different banks. All those banks were issuing their own paper currency, were taking excessive risks, and there was no clear rules and guidelines on how to oversee and control all of that, to make sure that the average Joe, the normal person, doesn't risk losing all of its money. So this was passed by President Woodrow Wilson, and the law also established the Fed's dual mandate for jobs and price stability. So important, the goal of the Fed is to make sure that there's enough employment and that prices are stable or at least growing at a consistent rate. Now, here you see a picture of the Federal Reserve Bank, some of its first few members and senators and government officials that were involved in establishing it. So what are some of the powers of the Federal Reserve? So in addition to printing money, so yes, you're right, they can print money, you've heard that correctly. It is possible to increase the money supply, but the Fed also has different powers. So the Fed received the power to adjust the discount rate and the Fed's fund rate, and to buy and sell US Treasuries. So again, it can print money, it can adjust the discount rate, it can adjust the federal funds rate, and it can buy and sell US Treasuries. So those are the four main powers of the Fed. So let's look at the federal funds rate first. So the federal funds rate is the target interest rate at which commercial banks borrow and lend their excess reserves to each other overnight, which is set by the Federal Open Market Committee, which is a body of the Federal Reserve. Now, here, I'm sure you've seen this guy, Fed Chair Powell. So he often, every once in a while, he makes a public announcement about the federal funds rate. So here you see during COVID, we basically saw practically 0% interest rates, which were set by the Fed. And then now more recently, 2022 until right now, 2025, we saw a massive increase in the interest rate. And then now more recently, they started to decrease the interest rate again because they believe the economy is strong and they have inflation under control. So the whole point of this interest rate is basically to control how cheap or expensive borrowing money is. When money is cheap, there will be a lot more borrowing, risk-taking. When money is expensive, people tend to take money out of circulation, put it in a savings account, and earn interest on that money. So, it basically controls the whole money supply, or the interest rate has a very big impact on how the money supply is controlled. So, what does it mean that the Federal Reserve is independent within the government? So, maybe this might shock you, but the Federal Reserve is not federal. It's a private entity owned by a cartel of bankers and financiers. So more about its creation in a bit. But what does it mean for the Federal Reserve to be independent within the government? Well, the Federal Reserve, like many other central banks, is an independent government agency, but also one that is ultimately accountable to the public and the Congress. The chair and other staff testify before Congress, and the board submits an extensive report called the Monetary Policy Report on recent economic developments and its plan for monetary policy twice a year. The board also makes public the system's independently audited financial statements along with the minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee meetings. The Federal Reserve does not receive funding through congressional budgetary process. The Fed's income comes primarily from the interest on government securities that it has acquired through open market operations. So guys, let's dissect this very quickly. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency, although this article that we just read might give a little bit of an unclear image of what the Federal Reserve is. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It's a private institution, and this private institution has the control over the money supply, over the interest rate, and it doesn't receive money from the government to operate like any other governmental agency. No, it earns money through interest on the debt that the US government has with the central bank. So again, think about this incentive. The central bank the Federal Reserve, it's the same, makes money on interest payments to the government. Now, or on loans it made to the government. Let that be clear. So when you're thinking about it in this way, if they make money on interest payments, they have the biggest incentive to make sure that the debt is as large as possible, because that means their interest rate is as big, that the interest payments are as big as possible. So yes, you've heard all of that right. So now we're slowly going deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. The Federal Reserve earns money on interest repayments and debt repayments. Now, here you see the structure. We have the Federal Reserve System, so the Federal Reserve Bank. Then we have the three key entities below it: the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve Banks, 12 Federal Reserve Banks in 12 different areas of the US, and we have the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets the interest rate, or the Fed funds rate. So those are the three main bodies. So let's talk about each of those. So the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, those contains the 12 heads of the Federal Reserve Banks. And in addition, it also has some key positions for senators and other government officials, which are elected. And then we have the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets the interest rates. Now, what are its 5 key functions of this entire structure? Is to conduct the nation's monetary policy, so determine, what's the best strategy around the money supply and the interest rate, helping to maintain the stability of the financial system, supervising and regulating financial institutions. Interesting, because I already gave you a little bit of a preview. The Federal Reserve Bank is actually owned by the banks, okay? So the banks would then be supervising the banks, which, again, interesting. Basically, it tells the banks, hey guys, go ahead, you can regulate yourself. Fostering payment and settlement system safety and efficiency, and promoting consumer protection and community development. So that is the whole Federal Reserve System. So another diagram to show you how all of this works. So Congress is overseeing the Federal Reserve System and its entities, basically meaning that the Board of Governors needs to report to Congress. However, Congress cannot dictate what they need to do because they're an independent agency. They basically took control of the money supply away from the government. How weird this may sound, it is totally true. The Federal Reserve is an independent company, an independent entity owned by a cartel of bankers and financiers. But they still need to report to Congress because they're being held accountable. But again, being held accountable doesn't mean that they must necessarily do what Congress says. So Board of Governors is an independent agency of the federal government. So they say an independent agency of government, but basically it means that it's outside of the government. It has its own autonomy to do what it wants and to dictate its actions. Then within the Federal Reserve System, you also have the Open Market Committee, which consists of members of the Board of Governors and Reserve Bank presidents. Sorry, I was wrong about this. So no Congress members. So it consists of members of the Board of Governors and the Reserve Bank presidents. And the chair of the board is the FOMC chair. Okay? And then we have the Federal Reserve Banks, which are the operating arms of the Federal Reserve System and are supervised by the Board of Governors. So those are the three entities within the Federal Reserve System. So we have the 12 banks, the 12 Federal Reserve Banks, we have the Board of Governors, and we have the FOMC. Now, inflation and interest rates tend to move in the same direction because interest rates are the primary tool used by the US Central Bank to manage inflation. So here you see the chart of inflation and the Fed funds rate. So the blue line, the lighter line that you see here in this chart is the Fed funds rate. Now, the dark blue line that you're seeing is the core CPI. So CPI stands for Consumer Price Index. Consumer Price Index basically gives you an index of, how is my purchasing power? How does the value of a basket of goods and products increases over time? So when the CPI increases, it means that my purchasing power drops because inflation is going up. So here you see that if we look at here 2020, you saw that CPI went up because we had a lot of money printing during COVID times. So CPI shot up, and as a result, the FOMC increased the federal funds rate. So meaning the interest rate. Why would you increase the interest rate when inflation goes up? Well, what is inflation? Inflation basically means that the value of your money slowly becomes worth less because the central bank has printed more money. There's more money in circulation. So what do you want to do when inflation is so high? You want to start taking some money out of circulation. So you do that by increasing the interest rate. When you increase the interest rate, people will start to borrow money less, and instead they will put it on a savings account, or they will start to buy some bonds because they want to, just store their money somewhere and earn a nice yield or earn a nice interest. So this takes money out of circulation. So here is an article that I wanted to show you. Effective March 26, 2020, the board reduced reserve requirement ratios on all net transaction accounts to 0%, eliminating reserve requirements for all depository institutions. Basically, what I wanted to tell you or show you with this article is that the Federal Reserve is actually not a reserve because there's a zero deposit requirement for banks and for the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is not federal. It's a private institution owned and run by a cartel of bankers and financiers. It is not a reserve because there's no reserve requirement. And in my opinion, it's one of the biggest counterfeit scams in history because they can just print money out of thin air. So here's a meme. The Federal Reserve isn't federal and there is no reserve. Let that sink in. It is the world's biggest counterfeit operation. So let's talk about open market operations. So the Federal Reserve policy of buying and selling US Treasury securities along with other securities on the open market in order to manage the money supply. So here's a diagram that shows how this works. The bank buys government bonds, and as a result, it will give money to the government. So this is how it works. The government issues bonds, and the Federal Reserve gives money to the government. And that's how this money goes into circulation. So the US Federal Reserve Bank just printed $300 billion out of thin air last week to bail out the bank. So this is a tweet by S.L. Cantan. So this is not free market or even capitalism. If developing nations want $300 billion, they have to sell their sovereignty to the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, the best possible analogy that I can give you for this whole situation is imagine that you're playing a game of Monopoly with a few of your friends. And when one of your friends sits next to the bank, so basically he has easy access to all of the money, and he wants to cheat, and when you're going to the restroom, he just takes a few bills out of the bank, and then suddenly you notice that he has a very big stack of cash, and every square that he lands on the Monopoly board, he seems to have an infinite money supply because he can buy all the houses, he can upgrade his houses to hotels. Whenever he needs to pay a fine, he has enough money to do so. And that's a similar scenario with the Federal Reserve. Whenever the US government has a shortage of cash, the Federal Reserve can simply print that money out of thin air, buy government bonds, and give this money to the government. And that is crazy, right? Because many other countries around the world can't really do this. They cannot print money out of thin air because, yes, their money becomes worthless over time. This basically results in hyperinflation in those developing countries and ultimately will bankrupt those nations. Well, then we have the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is basically an extension of the Federal Reserve, which can then borrow them money. But how is it possible that this whole system is still intact? Well, it has to do with the fact that the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, because so many countries are using this currency. For example, in South America, there's many countries which, instead of using their own currency, they're using the US dollar. There's a lot of international trade which is being done in US dollars, so they can basically pull it off. But not many other countries, or probably not any other country or even union of countries, can pull it off at the scale that the US is pulling it off. So here you see a meme of Fed Chair Powell, which is just printing money out of thin air. Here's an interesting cartoon. He's saying, you have to work the rest of your life for paper money that we create out of thin air and make you borrow from us and then charge you an interest rate and taxes on it. So, yeah, how insane does this sound, guys? So you work 40, 50 years of your life for paper money that is created out of thin air, and the people that are creating it aren't really held accountable. So here you see this cartoon also shows how it is possible that this system is still intact, because we all are trapped in the system. We all believe that the government is doing this for the good of mankind, to keep life stable, to make sure that we have employment, to make sure that we don't have hyperinflation. But because we are all, just accepting it, embracing it, this whole system is kept intact. So here you see this guy who says, fuck this, I'm out. If more people, or the majority of the people, would wake up and realize how messed up and rigged this system is, then the whole system would collapse as well. Now, wars make money. They're money machines, and some people become really wealthy. But who are the select few that make a lot of money through wars? Well, here you see a chart with the number of wars per year from 1500 all the way to right now. And when did the Federal Reserve get established again? Oh yeah, 1913. And what do we see on this chart? The number of wars suddenly goes up a lot. Well, is this a coincidence? Let's find out. Here is a quote by Ron Paul. He's saying, if every American taxpayer had to submit an extra $5,000 or $10,000 to the IRS this April to pay for the war, I'm quite certain it would end very quickly. The problem is that the government finances its wars by borrowing and printing money rather than presenting a bill directly in the form of higher taxes. When the costs are obscured, the question of whether any war is worth it becomes distorted. Again, because the taxpayer doesn't need to pay when the taxpayer doesn't have to pay the bill today, it doesn't directly associate the actions with the future cost that it will have, because you're basically borrowing money against the future to fund a war today. Now, there is a history of the Federal Reserve funding wars. The Federal Reserve's role during World War I. So the Federal Reserve faced its first major test during World War I. It helped finance the war by facilitating war bond sales and by providing loans at preferential rates to banks purchasing treasury certificates. So again, the Federal Reserve was a very important instrument in funding World War I. So here you see some images of World War One. And it didn't only do this in World War One. It was actually here you see some more images of how the Federal Reserve helped the government. So here, lend your money to your government, buy a United States government bond. Second Liberty Loan of 1917. US Treasury will pay you interest every 6 months. So here is this joint effort of the US government with the Federal Reserve to fund these bonds or to get funding for these bonds. Have you bought your Liberty bond? Here, all right. Hello, this is Liberty speaking. Billions of dollars are needed and needed now. Okay, and now also World War II. The Fed pegged interest rates at a low level during World War II and enforced a peg after the war. So again, they made sure that there were low interest rates so that the government could borrow a lot of money. The Federal Reserve, actually also very actively interacted with different players in the world. So here, the Federal Reserve interactions with Japanese Americans during World War II. As part of the war effort, the Fed was assigning a duty well outside its normal activities. Let that sink in again. So the Federal Reserve goes out of its way to make sure that, it has influence and it brokers power across the world. Here, World War II and its aftermath, so the monetary policy fundamentally changed during the period of 1914 and 1951. So here you see buy war bonds. So in short, the Federal Reserve is very involved in funding wars. So is the Fed instigating conflicts for profits? Do you think they would be able to do that? Or are they just here because they want to have a positive impact in the world and they have, they are just thinking about your best interest? Now, what if I told you that banks always win every war? Would you believe that? Here's an example, an historic example of the Rothschild family. So if you don't know who the Rothschild family is, they are a Jewish banking dynasty. And in the Napoleonic times, they funded their... So let's take a few steps back. The Rothschild family has many different branches in different countries. The UK, France, Germany, and other areas of Europe. And during the Napoleonic Wars, they funded both sides of the war, meaning that multiple countries got indebted by them and, they needed to fund their current war. So they borrowed lots of money from these Rothschild families, these different branches in different countries. And as a result, after the war, these countries had to pay back their debts plus interest to the Rothschilds. And like I mentioned, no matter what side won, the bankers won because the countries had to pay back their debts plus interest payments, and this made them very wealthy and influential. Here you see the greatest extent of the Napoleonic Empire. So the Empire of France, states allied with Napoleon, states against Napoleon. So UK, Russian Empire. They were, as far as I understood, there was a UK branch of the Rothschilds funding the war from the UK side, and there was a French side of the Rothschilds that was funding the Napoleon side. And this was a very lucrative industry. So yes, the banking system has a history of funding wars, and not just one side of the war. It can even fund two sides of the war. So it has an incentive to create conflict around the world, because what is the whole business model of a bank? To lend out money so that it can get interest payments on that money. That is the whole business model of a bank. And that's what is needed during a war. Those who opposed the central bank in the USA were assassinated or faced heavy consequences. So there's a book written about the history of central banks in the US. The Federal Reserve is actually the third central bank that the US had. So throughout its history, you saw the first central bank, which was shut down by a president, then the second central bank, which was shut down by another president. And yeah, those presidents that fought it faced heavy consequences. For example, here you see Abraham Lincoln. He was assassinated on April 14th, 1865. Now here's a quote by Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the US. He says, "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency," remember what I told you earlier in this video, the Federal Reserve is not federal because it's owned by a cartel of bankers and financiers. It's basically a private entity, and a private entity that is controlling the money supply. So this is exactly what Thomas Jefferson is talking about. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, so printing money, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all their property until their children wake up homeless and the continent their fathers conquered. On the continent their fathers conquered. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken away from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it belongs. So I'm not sure how aware you are of what's currently happening in the world with the globalists, the World Economic Forum, and their mantra, their ultimate goal of owning nothing and being happy. That is literally what they're trying to achieve. So through this banking system, which pushes the wealth up to the financial elites through inflation, for example, but also financial enslavement, it's a very dangerous system. And it's exactly what the founding father or one of the founding fathers of the US was warning its people about. Now, ultimately, the bankers succeeded and managed to enslave the USA, and not only the US, also the rest of the world. Because nowadays, we have a new form of imperialism, all right? So back in the days, the country where I'm from, the Netherlands, we used to be a world superpower because we were sailing all across the world, and we would have colonies, for example, in Indonesia, in South Africa, in South America, Suriname, and Great Britain also had a lot of colonies, Australia, Canada, and other parts of the world. And this was typical for that era. But nowadays, it is not possible anymore to, just enter a country and tell them like, all right, now you are our property. Now you citizens, you are our slaves and you need to work for us. And we're going to take all of your money and take it to our own country to build up our wealth. That was done back in the days. Nowadays, we are more sophisticated. We are more, inclusive. We respect liberties and human rights. But nothing is less true. Nowadays, we still have imperialism, but it's through debt. By lending a lot of money to countries that they can't really pay back. And when they can't pay back their debt repayments and interest payments, then you can take action and seize control of the country or key assets. However, let's first talk about the US. So here you see the US national debt. So right now, there's around $36 trillion of national debt. That's insane, okay? That's a massive amount. And it's getting to the point where the interest payments on the debt are almost as big as the amount of tax that the government is collecting. So that would mean that every single year, all of the taxes that need to be raised or basically paid by the citizens of the US are almost equal to the interest payments on the debt. So that is quite crazy, right? And that is almost getting unhealthy. Now, every time a new war is started, for example, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel. All of that needs to be funded. And how does it get funded? By printing more money, okay? And by going into debt even further. Because again, what we mentioned earlier here in this quote, if the taxpayer has to pay money right away, so hey, if for example, the US government would make an announcement, hey guys, we're going to go to war in Israel and it's going to all cost you, I don't know, $50,000 this year, which you need to pay in taxes. Trust me, nobody is going to pay that. So instead, they borrow from the future by printing money and borrowing money. So war creates debt, and debt enriches the central banks. Why? The bigger this number becomes, this 36 trillion, the more interest needs to be paid on that debt, and the more the central bank earns. Every major war in history has led to continuous borrowing heavily from private banks to finance their military efforts. So right now we are in a very tense world. We have some issues in Ukraine. So there's a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. There's a lot of tension in the Middle East with Iran and Israel. Then we have, of course, China, which is becoming super powerful and which is threatening to take back Taiwan. Then we have North Korea, which has apparently a nuclear missile arsenal, and nobody really wants to find out how willing they are to push the button and destroy the entire world if it comes down to a war. Then we have Japan, which is basically, worried about protecting the its surroundings and its own sovereignty with the rising threat of China in their area. We have NATO with our old president Rutte, the Dutch president, and Putin, of course, which is being super powerful and making lots of claims on the internet about being willing to push the nuclear button when it comes down to further escalation. So how do bankers profit from wars afterwards? Well, after the war, countries remain in debt, paying interest indefinitely. So here, that's the situation we had with the Napoleonic Wars. No matter what side of the war won, countries went into debt and they needed to pay back that debt plus interest. This reconstruction creates even more borrowing. So, for example, let's take Ukraine. When Ukraine gets bombed, it needs to be rebuilt. And this rebuilding indeed requires a country or involved industries to borrow more money to make sure that, they actually deliver on those plans. And also war allows for the restructuring of global systems. So the more fear there is, the more pressure there is, the more pain there is, the more you can enforce new laws and regulations, new systems, potentially replacing the current financial system with a more controlled, centralized one. And that might be exactly the agenda that the central bank has, and with the central bank, I mean the US central bank, so the Federal Reserve, and the financial elite. So nowadays we live in a world where we have a generation of globalists. What are globalists? Those are industry tycoons who have already achieved almost everything they can achieve financially. However, at that point, when they're multi-billionaires, the extra billions will not really give them much more satisfaction. At that point, they are craving for more control, for more power. They basically want to become the gods of the financial system. And who am I talking about? Well, for example, George Soros. George Soros is a multi-billionaire and he's funding many different political entities to exert influence. And he is known for, pushing his agenda for a global economy, an economy in which he and his partners can exert more influence and power. So could World War III be used to force a CBDC on us? Well, what is a CBDC? A CBDC is a central bank digital currency. It's basically a digital variation of our current currencies. Now you might wonder, well, the dollar, the euro, the yen, in part, they're already digital, because when I open my bank account, I see some numbers on my screen. And yeah, that's true. So yes, it's partly digital. However, it's not yet programmable. Think about it in this way. In the crypto space, we have Ethereum. Ethereum is known as a smart contract blockchain, meaning that you can program money on the blockchain. You can create smart contracts. So you can create some kind of logic on the blockchain that when a certain event happens, then another action gets triggered. So for example, let's say that you create an insurance company on the blockchain. And let's say that there's a shipment of goods that need to be cooled. So let's say that you have a shipment of ice cream. And in the truck, you have a sensor that's constantly measuring the temperature of that ice cream in the truck. Now, you've created an insurance policy that if the temperature increases above a certain, temperature, then the insurance policy must automatically pay you money because your goods have gone bad. So you can program all of this on the blockchain, and yeah, it becomes programmable. Similarly, CBDCs are a form of programmable money issued by the government. So let's say that in China, you have this social points system where you as a citizen can earn social points if you display good behavior, but also if you display bad behavior. For example, if you just cross the street and you do some jaywalking, the traffic light is on red and you cross the street, then you might get some points deducted from your social score. If you have a speeding ticket by driving in your car, again, points can get deducted from your social score. This might in turn take away some of your privileges to buy certain goods or products, or maybe even to buy an airplane ticket and to travel outside of the country. So that is what CBDCs will actually do. They're a completely digital form of money that are programmable and that the government can really track, so they can see every single movement of that money, and they can program it to put certain parameters of what you can or cannot do with that money specific to the person or company. So again, that's a next level of government control. So here is what the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System says about CBDCs. While the Federal Reserve has made no decision on whether to pursue the implementation of a central bank digital currency, we have been exploring the potential benefits and risks of CBDCs from a variety of angles, including through technological research and experimentation. Our key focus is on whether and how a CBDC could improve on an already safe and efficient US domestic payment system. So what this is saying on the official side of the Fed is that they're already looking into it and experimenting with it and researching it and checking out the potential benefits. Now, RFK Jr. says the Fed just centralizes wealth and creates war. The Fed is captive by the big banks and Wall Street. They use this cycle of quantitative easing followed by high interest rates like a trap. They made the trap with quantitative easing, which is easy money, and then they raise the interest rates. Everybody goes bankrupt, the equity becomes available, and JP Morgan and BlackRock and State Street purchase the equity. So again, it's a play by the financial elites. And this comes from someone that's very deep into politics and that can really understands the game that the big players are playing. It's a system. It's been this system for shifting wealth upwards, beginning most dramatically with the 2008 housing crash. Nobody got punished, nobody went to jail. And the people who got bailed out were the banks rather than the customers. They lost their property and the banks ended up owning everything. So again, the central bank, the Fed, is owned by the banks, by a cartel of banks and financiers. It's not a government entity, it's a private entity owned by private companies. And this private entity controls the money supply and the interest rate. And when everything goes bad, well, then basically it bails out the banks so that they can survive. And those same banks can acquire those assets at a discount, basically swallowing up all of the wealth. So this whole Federal Reserve System, this central bank system, is a wealth shifting mechanism from the masses to the financial elites. The people who created the crisis ended up profiting from it. There's also a connection between the Fed's ability to print as much money as it can and and the war machine. You can't make war unless you have fiat currency. From the Latino Capitalist Town Hall. So by now, you're probably seeing how the Federal Reserve and wars are correlated, and how potentially they can create World War III on a massive scale, to the point that the US government and other countries around the world need to borrow so much money that at one point there is no other option than to reset the whole financial system and to introduce a CBDC, the US dollar digital or something like that, which allows them to enforce even bigger control upon its citizens and the world. So fortunately, there's a way to opt out of the system. So here's a case for Bitcoin to separate money from the state. So by separating money from the government, Bitcoin takes the control of money out of the hands of politicians and gives it back to the citizens. Bitcoin is money for the people, created by the people and managed by the people. There's no greedy bankers, no greedy central bankers or financial elite that own or control Bitcoin. And that's the beauty. Whereas the central bank is very centralized. It's almost like a black box. A few people really hold the power within the central bank. They call all the shots and they determine how everything else goes. With Bitcoin, that's not the case. Bitcoin is decentralized, meaning that the community manages Bitcoin. There's no one single person or entity that calls the shots. And that's the whole beauty of Bitcoin, because it's open, it's transparent, everyone can participate, there's no censorship, and there's many different people and very intelligent people involved in the network. You can assume that automatically the whole community chooses what is best for the community, not what is best for one individual or one entity or one business. So recently, Trump confirmed that he is interested in creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And this is expected, or it is expected, that as a result, we will see a $15 trillion price boom in Bitcoin. So right now, Bitcoin is hovering around $2 trillion of market cap. But when the US starts to buy up Bitcoin, then it could actually increase to $15 trillion of valuation. Now, why would Donald Trump actually decide to do this? Why would they decide to do this? Because they're talking about buying up. They already own 200,000 Bitcoin, but they're talking about buying up to 1 million Bitcoin. So one of the best case studies to explain this is the case study of El Salvador. El Salvador has been buying up Bitcoin every single day, so for the past few years, and now they no longer need external financing. It's almost like they became financially free, but on a nation state level. And what we saw was that when Donald Trump was campaigning earlier last year, there was an assassination attempt on him. He was shot in his ear at one of his rallies. And you might wonder, Donald Trump has been so open and outspoken about establishing a Bitcoin strategic reserve to pay off its national debt. And when this national debt gets paid off, the interest payments of this debt, shrink. And basically it means that the central bank, so the Federal Reserve, earns less money. Also probably meaning that it will be less powerful when the government doesn't need to rely on this external financing anymore. So could this have been a plot from the financial elite and the central bankers to assassinate Donald Trump, because it is not really aligned with the plan that they had in mind? Well, I'm leaving that up to you. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below. So let's recap everything. We have discussed how the Federal Reserve came into existence after the Panic of 1907. We saw the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. And as soon as the Federal Reserve got established, we saw a correlation between the number of wars that were fought across the world and the establishment of the Federal Reserve, of course. And this all also aligns with the history of the banking dynasties across the world that have been funding wars. Not even, one side of a war, but multiple sides of the war, because no matter what side of the war wins, bankers always win because countries go into debt, which increases the interest payments, which gives them more power and probably results in even more borrowing, having to rebuild the entire nation or parts of the nation or particular industries. And this gives more control to the banks or the central banks and the bankers that actually control the central banks and the financial elite that control the financial banks. And all of it seems to be one rigged system, one rigged game where this is all a wealth transferring system from the masses to the financial elite. I'm really curious if that's also your conclusion from all of the data and the insights that you have seen in this video. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed watching this video, do me one quick favor, smash the like button so I know that you got good value out of it. And if you haven't done so yet, also make sure to subscribe to my channel because I'm going to be posting regular videos just like this one to help you to make sense of everything that's going on there in the world, and to make sure that you are well positioned to maximize your profits in the market. My goal is to help as many of you to cross the finish line as possible. And the only way to do that is by staying informed about everything that's going on. All right, thank you, peace out, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.